Every glass of rum you have ever seen tucked inside a coconut shell, crowned with a tiny paper umbrella, and served on a bar shaped like a canoe, has a body count behind it. Centuries of naval warfare, enslaved labor on sugar plantations across the Caribbean, and enough floggings and keel haulings to fill an entire library of British military records. For over 300 years, the Royal Navy handed every single sailor a daily cup of rum, not because they liked the taste, but because it kept men fighting, kept them obedient, and kept them from dying of whatever was growing in the drinking water. What nobody knew at the time was that this same gritty, blood-soaked spirit would eventually be dressed up in pineapple juice, set on fire, and served to sunburned tourists in Hawaiian shirts as the official drink of relaxation. But this story doesn't start with cocktail umbrellas or naval admirals. It starts with garbage. Literal garbage. 17th century Barbados, in the Caribbean, was the engine of the British sugar trade. Thousands of enslaved Africans worked the sugar plantations that made English merchants filthy rich. Sugar was the gold of the colonial era, and every ounce of it had to be refined before it could be shipped back to London. That refining process produced massive quantities of a thick, dark, sticky byproduct called molasses, and at first the plantation owners had absolutely no idea what to do with it. Molasses was waste. It piled up, it attracted flies, it rotted in the tropical heat. Then someone, likely enslaved workers on the plantations themselves, discovered that if you mixed molasses with water and left it in the sun, it fermented. And if you distilled that fermented liquid through a crude still, you got something drinkable, barely drinkable, if we're being honest. The earliest versions of Caribbean rum were rough. We're talking about a spirit that burned going down, tasted like a swamp, and could probably strip the varnish off a ship's deck. Colonists in Barbados called it Kill Devil, which tells you everything you need to know about the experience of drinking it. A document from 1651 described it as a hot, hellish, and terrible liquor. The French colonists in Martinique called it tafia and considered it a drink for the lower classes, something no respectable person would touch. But here is the thing about a cheap, strong drink made from something that would otherwise be thrown away. People want it. Especially people who live hard, dangerous lives with very few pleasures available to them. Sailors, soldiers, plantation workers, enslaved people who had nothing else. Rum became the drink of everyone the British Empire used up and threw away, long before it became anyone's idea of a vacation. By the late 1600s, rum had spread across the entire Caribbean. It was cheap to produce, easy to transport, and it did not spoil on long ocean voyages the way beer did. That last detail is the one that changed everything, because it caught the attention of the one institution that ran on long ocean voyages more than any other in the world, the British Royal Navy. For a while, things actually seemed fine. English warships had traditionally issued their sailors a daily ration of beer. A gallon per man per day, which sounds insane, but the beer was weak and it served a practical purpose. Drinking water aboard wooden ships in the tropics went bad fast. It turned green. It grew algae. It made people sick. Alcohol, even weak alcohol, stayed drinkable. That didn't last. The problem was storage. Beer took up enormous amounts of space in a ship's hold. Barrels and barrels of it, crowding out ammunition, food, and supplies. And even with all that volume, the beer would still go sour after a few weeks at sea. The Navy briefly switched to brandy, which lasted longer, but brandy was French, and England was almost always at war with France. Buying your enemy's liquor to fuel your own military was not exactly a winning strategy. Rum solved everything. It was British, produced in British colonies. It was strong, so you needed less volume per man, and it lasted essentially forever in a barrel. By 1655, when the British captured Jamaica from Spain, rum became the official spirit of the Royal Navy. Every sailor got a daily ration called a tot, half a pint of neat rum issued at noon. I mean, think about that for a second. Half a pint of straight, overproof rum every single day to every man on board. These were not cocktail strength pours. This was roughly 70% alcohol by volume, Sailors were operating cannons, climbing, rigging, and navigating warships while functionally hammered by lunchtime. The Navy realized this was a problem around 1740 when Admiral Edward Vernon decided that issuing raw, undiluted rum to thousands of armed men on floating wooden gun platforms might not be the safest management strategy. Vernon ordered the daily tot diluted with water, usually at a ratio of 4 parts water to 1 part rum, with a squeeze of lime juice and some sugar. The sailors immediately hated it. They nicknamed the mixture Grog, after Vernon's waterproof Grogram cloak, and they meant it as an insult. Vernon had watered down the one thing that made their miserable lives bearable. If you're wondering how that's even legal, so is everyone else. But Vernon was an admiral, and admirals didn't need to ask permission. The lime juice addition, though accidental in its intent, turned out to be one of the most important medical decisions in naval history. Nobody understood vitamin C yet. Scurvy was killing more British sailors than enemy fire, French cannonballs, and storms combined. A sailor with scurvy watched his gums rot, his teeth fall out, and old wounds reopen as if they had never healed. On long voyages, entire crews were decimated. The limes in the grog ration quietly began preventing scurvy across the fleet. The Navy would not fully understand why this worked for another 50 years. They just noticed that the men drinking grog were dying less, and that was good enough. It is one of history's stranger ironies that a cost-cutting measure to water down liquor accidentally saved thousands of lives. This is also, by the way, the reason British sailors became known as limeys, a nickname that stuck for centuries. This daily rum ritual became more than just a drink. It was the backbone of naval life. The tot was issued at noon, announced by a boatswain's pipe, and served with ceremony. Sailors lined up, received their measure, and drank it on the spot. No saving it, no trading it. The rum ration marked the middle of the day, broke the monotony, and gave men something to look forward to during weeks and months of open ocean, cramped quarters, rotten food, and the constant possibility of violent death. Everything was in place. The Navy just didn't know what everything was building toward. The rum ration did something else, too. It created an entire mythology, because the same Caribbean waters where the Royal Navy sailed, its warships were also home to the most famous criminals in maritime history, pirates. The golden age of piracy in the early 1700s ran on rum the same way the Navy did. Pirates captured merchant ships carrying barrels of the stuff, raided sugar plantations that produced it, and used rum as actual currency aboard their vessels. A pirate captain who kept the rum flowing kept his crew loyal. One who ran out of it risked mutiny. Blackbeard reportedly mixed rum with gunpowder and drank it flaming, which is either deeply impressive or deeply concerning, depending on your threshold for self-preservation. Pirate ships operated as crude democracies. Crews voted on their captains, agreed on rules, and split their plunder according to written articles, and rum was written into those articles. Some pirate codes explicitly guaranteed every man his fair share of captured rum, before gold, silver, or any other loot was divided. Captains who tried to hoard liquor did not stay captains for very long. The politics of rum on a pirate ship were more democratic than most of the nations those pirates had deserted. Rum was the fuel of rebellion on the open water, the drink you reached for when you had rejected the rules of empire and decided to make your own. And this is the part that makes the later Tiki reinventions so absurd. Rum was never a fun drink. It was a survival drink, a wartime drink, a drink of desperation and violence and exploitation. The sugar that made it was harvested by enslaved people. The ships that carried it were armed to the teeth. The men who drank it were either serving the crown under brutal conditions or actively trying to rob anyone who did. Rum tasted like empire, and empire tasted like blood. For over 200 years after Vernon's grog order, the Daily Tot continued aboard every Royal Navy vessel. It sailed through the Napoleonic Wars, where Admiral Nelson's fleet smashed the French at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Nelson himself was killed in that battle, and legend has it that his body was preserved in a barrel of brandy for the voyage home, though some versions of the story insist it was rum. Sailors supposedly tapped the barrel and drank from it, giving birth to the phrase, "tapping the admiral." Whether that actually happened is debatable. That the story exists at all tells you something about the relationship between the Royal Navy and its liquor. The tot continued through both world wars and into the Cold War era. The tradition survived technological revolutions, the transition from sail to steam to nuclear power, and the complete transformation of naval warfare from wooden ships, exchanging cannon volleys to submarines, launching ballistic missiles from beneath the ocean surface. Up to this point, the Royal Navy had been the world's most reliable rum customer. That was about to flip. By the mid-20th century, the Admiralty was facing a reality it could no longer ignore. Modern warships were not wooden gun platforms. They were floating weapons systems packed with radar arrays, communications equipment, torpedoes, depth charges, and in some cases, nuclear reactors. The idea of issuing alcohol to the men operating this machinery was starting to look less like tradition and more like institutional negligence. The rum tot had survived 3 centuries, but it could not survive the safety standards of the modern military. On July 31st, 1970, the Royal Navy issued its final daily rum ration. Sailors across the fleet held mock funerals. They wore black armbands. On some ships, they carried a rum barrel draped in the Union Jack through the mess deck while someone played the last post on a bugle. Officers and ratings alike lined up for one final tot, raised their glasses, and drank it down in silence. Some poured their last measure over the side of the ship, into the sea. The date became known as Black Tot Day, and veterans who served through it still talk about it like a death in the family. The question in Parliament that had killed the tradition was almost comically dry. A Labour MP asked the Defence Secretary whether the rum ration was compatible with the high standards of efficiency required of modern armed forces. The answer, obviously, was no. 315 years of tradition ended with a bureaucratic memo and a funeral march. The Navy's rum was gone. But rum itself was about to get a second life that nobody could have predicted. And the person who kicked it off was not a sailor or a pirate or a plantation owner. He was a bootlegger from Texas named Ernest Gant. If you're finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week. So, the Royal Navy's centuries-old rum tradition was dead and buried. But what Ernest Gant did next made all of that history look like a prologue. Gant had spent time traveling around the Caribbean and the South Pacific during the 1920s and 30s, collecting recipes, decor, and a general vibe that he would later package into something entirely new. In 1933, right after Prohibition ended in the United States, Gant opened a small bar in Hollywood, California, called Don's Beachcomber. He changed his name to Don Beach, because apparently Ernest Gant from Texas did not scream tropical paradise. The bar was a fantasy. Gant covered it in bamboo, tiki torches, fishing nets, and carved wooden masks. He played Hawaiian and Polynesian music on a loop, and the centerpiece of the entire experience was the drink menu, which was loaded with rum cocktails designed to taste nothing like rum. The Zombie, the Missionary's Downfall, drinks piled with fruit juice, orgeat syrup, cinnamon, and enough garnishes to build a small garden. The rum was still there, often in enormous quantities, but it was hidden under so many layers of tropical sweetness that you could barely taste it. The gritty, violent, empire-forged spirit of the Royal Navy was now arriving at your table in a ceramic mug shaped like an Easter Island head, and people lost their minds over it. A few years later, a competing restaurateur named Victor Bergeron, better known as Trader Vic, opened his own Polynesian-themed restaurant in Oakland. Trader Vic claimed to have invented the Mai Tai in 1944, a claim Don Beach disputed until the day he died. The rivalry between them only made Tiki culture bigger. You didn't have to pick a side, you could just drink both of their rum cocktails. Then World War II ended, and the Tiki movement exploded. Hundreds of thousands of American servicemen who had spent years fighting across the Pacific Islands came home with a complicated nostalgia for the tropics. They had seen places like Fiji, Samoa, Guadalcanal, and Okinawa. They had experienced the South Pacific firsthand, under the worst possible circumstances, and many of them found that the fantasy version offered by Don Beach and Trader Vic scratched an emotional itch nothing else could. Tiki bars offered a sanitized, escapist version of the Pacific, all warmth and beauty and exotic mystery, stripped of everything that had actually happened there. War, death, destruction, disease, malaria. The jungle rot that ate through boots and skin alike. Tiki culture took the Pacific and made it safe for cocktail hour. It gave veterans a place to sit with their memories, while pretending those memories were about paradise and not about combat. Nobody said anything about that out loud. That was sort of the point. And rum was the engine of the whole thing. The spirit that had once been inseparable from naval gunfire and the sugar plantation was now inseparable from leisure, escape, and the suburban American dream. By the 1950s, tiki bars were everywhere across the United States. Shopping malls had them. Hotels built entire Polynesian-themed wings. The Mai Tai, the Piña Colada, the Daiquiri, and dozens of other rum cocktails became the soundtrack of American recreation. Suburban families threw backyard luau parties with rum punch served in hollowed-out pineapples. Restaurants like Trader Vic's expanded into global chains, serving flaming rum cocktails to businessmen in Tokyo, London, and Chicago. The aesthetic was everywhere. Bamboo furniture, carved tiki masks, fake waterfalls, bartenders in aloha shirts mixing drinks with the seriousness of chemists. Don Beach guarded his recipes so fiercely that he labeled the ingredients in his cocktails with coded numbers so his bartenders could not steal them. Rum was no longer what you drank when the world was trying to kill you. It was what you drank when you wanted to forget the world existed. Nobody said anything about the history. Nobody talked about the enslaved people who had first fermented molasses in Barbados. Nobody mentioned the flogged sailors who drank their grog ration before climbing the mast in a storm. Nobody brought up the pirates, the violence, the blood-soaked Caribbean sugar trade that made the entire thing possible. Tiki culture didn't just ignore rum's past, it erased it. And it replaced that past with plastic lees, paper parasols, and a Jimmy Buffett song. The reinvention was so complete that by the late 20th century, most people associated rum primarily with vacation, college spring break trips, beach resorts, all-inclusive hotel bars where a sunburned guy in flip-flops orders a frozen strawberry daiquiri at 11 in the morning. The idea that this same liquid had once been the daily fuel of the most dominant naval force on Earth, issued under military discipline to men preparing for combat, felt like a prank. But in the last 20 years or so, something interesting has started to happen. A craft rum movement, similar to what happened with whiskey and gin, has begun pushing back against the tiki fantasy. Distillers in Barbados, Jamaica, Martinique, and across the Caribbean are producing rums meant to be sipped neat, appreciated for their complexity, and understood within their full historical context. Jamaican pot still rums with funky, overripe fruit flavors. Barbadian rums aged in bourbon casks for a decade. Rhum agricole from Martinique, made directly from fresh sugarcane juice instead of molasses, carrying an entirely different flavor profile that purists argue is the truest expression of the spirit. Some of these producers are actively reckoning with the colonial and slavery-driven origins of their industry. Distilleries that once avoided mentioning the word slavery are now incorporating the full history into their tours, their labels, and their marketing. They are not trying to erase the darkness. They are trying to make sure the bottle you are holding tells the whole story, not just the fun parts. Rum went from waste product to wartime ration, to pirate currency, to imperial tradition, to tiki fantasy, to craft spirit. Every version of it erased the one that came before. The sailors forgot the enslaved workers. The pirates forgot the sailors. The tiki bars forgot all of them. And now, maybe, the craft movement is trying to remember. Don Beach promised his customers paradise. The Royal Navy promised its sailors survival. The enslaved workers on those Barbados plantations were never promised anything at all. But the drink they accidentally created outlasted every empire, every navy, and every neon cocktail sign that came after it. If you found this story as wild as we did, The video on your screen right now goes deeper into another everyday thing with a history nobody talks about. Click it.